The courtroom was packed, but the focus was on one person, Pam Bondi. Florida's former Attorney General, notorious for her controversial legal decisions, was standing in front of Judge Harrison. He had a reputation for being tough on legal infractions, and today, it seemed, Bondi would be the one to face his wrath. "I'm going to fine you, Ms. Bondi, for your blatant disregard of the law," Judge Harrison announced, his voice booming throughout the courtroom. "Your actions have caused irreparable harm to the people you swore to protect." Bondi didn't flinch. In fact, she seemed almost too calm as she stood at the defense table, her sharp blue eyes fixed on the judge. The murmurs from the gallery were palpable, with everyone eager to see how the former Attorney General would handle the situation. "You'll be fined, and I expect the payment to be made within 30 days, the judge continued, ready to deliver what seemed like a decisive blow. But Bondi had been in this situation before. She knew how to play the game. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady and cool, "with all due respect, I believe you've misunderstood the legal circumstances here." Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow. "Misunderstood? Ms. Bondi, I've reviewed the case extensively. You've broken several statutes. Are you suggesting that I am wrong?" Bondi's lips curled into a slight smile. "Not at all, Your Honor. I'm simply pointing out that the statutes you've cited don't apply in this case." The courtroom went silent, all eyes shifting from the judge to Bondi, who seemed to have just turned the tables on him. "How do you mean?" Harrison demanded, his tone now more curious than combative. "I don't see how you could have grounds to dispute this." Pam Bondi stepped forward, ready to make her move. "I'm prepared to demonstrate that not only is your ruling based on a misapplication of the law, but that my legal interpretation is, in fact, supported by several precedents that you may have overlooked." A few gasps echoed through the room as people started to realize what was happening. Bondi wasn't just defending herself. She was setting the stage to turn the case around entirely. Judge Harrison, visibly irritated but now intrigued, waved his hand dismissively. "Fine. Go ahead. But I don't think you'll change my mind." Pam Bondi smiled again, her mind already calculating her next steps. The game was just beginning. Pam Bondi stood tall, her posture confident as she approached the judge's bench. The courtroom was dead quiet, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. No one had expected her to respond this way. Most of them thought she'd just accept the fine and move on. After all, it was a straightforward case, right? Wrong. Bondi, now in full control of the narrative, began her defense. "Your Honor," she started, her voice calm and collected, "I will first draw your attention to Section 101 of the Civil Procedure Code. It's crucial to understanding the nuance of this case." The judge's eyes narrowed, and for the first time since the hearing began, his gaze shifted from irritated to focused. He had been a judge for decades, and yet here was Pam Bondi, the very woman who had served as Florida's Attorney General, telling him that he had overlooked something. As she spoke, Bondi seamlessly referenced specific legal cases, binding precedents, and obscure clauses in the law that most lawyers wouldn't even dare to mention in a courtroom this crowded. She was a maestro, guiding the entire room through complex legal jargon like a seasoned performer. Judge Harrison's expression wavered from skepticism to something far less certain. He didn't interrupt, he didn't need to. Bondi's argument was so meticulously crafted, so solid, that he couldn't find a single flaw in it. The room, however, wasn't just captivated by her argument. They were now questioning themselves, had they misjudged Pam Bondi? Was she truly the incompetent politician they had all heard about, or was there more to her legal acumen than they realized? As per the ruling in the case of Thompson v. State, the specific application of Statute 12-453A, Bondi continued, "The fine you imposed, Judge, fails to account for the unique circumstances of my actions. And, furthermore, the precedent in the aforementioned case has established a legal cushion that effectively negates the penalty." The courtroom was silent. The words hung in the air as if suspended by the weight of their implications. Judge Harrison shifted in his seat, clearly unnerved. Are you suggesting that I have completely misunderstood the scope of the law in this matter? Bondi, without missing a beat, replied, "Yes, Your Honor. Not only have you misunderstood it, but you've also failed to apply it in the manner intended by the legislature." A few gasps echoed again from the gallery. This was no longer just a legal battle. It was a power struggle, a test of wills between a judge who prided himself on his legal wisdom and a woman whose legal mind was clearly just as sharp, if not sharper. The judge gripped the edge of his bench, his knuckles white. He was visibly trying to control his emotions. "I'll allow a recess for further review of your argument, Ms. Bondi. This is highly irregular. I don't take kindly to being questioned in such a manner, especially by someone who once held such a high office." Pam Bondi nodded, a glimmer of satisfaction in her eyes. "I understand, Your Honor. And I appreciate your willingness to reconsider your ruling." As the judge called for a recess, the gallery buzzed with whispers. Some were shocked at her audacity, others were impressed by her legal prowess. Bondi had pulled off something few people had ever been able to do. She'd turned the case on its head, and now it was only a matter of time before the judge acknowledged his mistake. But as the recess began, no one could have predicted just how much her next move would shake the entire courtroom. As the recess began, the courtroom buzzed with murmurs and hushed discussions. It was clear that Pam Bondi's argument had thrown Judge Harrison off balance. Lawyers exchanged glances, some unsure whether they should be impressed or worried. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with the scent of impending conflict. Pam Bondi, however, was cool as a cucumber. She leaned back in her seat, crossed her legs, and pulled out a small legal pad, making notes and preparing herself for whatever came next. She knew the game wasn't over, this was only the beginning. Judge Harrison stood up, clearly troubled by the turn of events. He stepped out of the courtroom to confer with his clerks. Bondi watched him leave with a faint, knowing smile. She had just cracked open the door to her victory, and now it was only a matter of whether the judge would walk through it or slam it shut in her face. As the recess dragged on, the atmosphere grew even more tense. The whispers grew louder, and a few of the spectators started to realize that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Pam Bondi, the controversial figure they all thought was a legal liability, was now the one on the offensive. After what seemed like an eternity, Judge Harrison returned to the bench. The doors to the courtroom slammed shut, and all eyes turned to him. He stood there for a moment, staring down at the case file in his hands, clearly trying to maintain an air of authority despite the crack in his previously unshakable demeanor. "I have reviewed your argument, Ms. Bondi," Judge Harrison began, his voice tinged with an edge of irritation. "And I must admit, you've raised some very compelling points." He paused, allowing the words to hang in the air. The courtroom fell silent, waiting for his next move. Bondi's face remained stoic, but inside, she was preparing herself for the counterattack she knew was coming. Judge Harrison wasn't the type to back down without a fight. He had to regain control, or risk losing credibility. However, he continued, "I am not so easily swayed. Legal precedents are one thing, but my decision is based on what I believe is in the best interest of justice." Pam Bondi's lips curled slightly. "Your Honor," she said, her tone unflinching, "I am not suggesting that you disregard your judgment. But you must understand that this case isn't about what's convenient or what feels just. It's about applying the law as it was intended." There was a slight shift in the room as spectators held their breath. The battle between them had just escalated to an intellectual duel. Judge Harrison hesitated. "I am not without my doubts," he admitted, his voice betraying a rare moment of vulnerability. "But I must consider the larger implications of this case, Ms. Bondi. A ruling in your favor could set a dangerous precedent. It could open the floodgates for others to question established rulings." Bondi leaned forward, her gaze locked onto the judge. "And yet, Your Honor, isn't that the very role of the courts? To question established rulings when new information comes to light. Justice is not a static thing, it evolves." The room fell completely still. Bondi had just delivered the final blow. She wasn't just defending herself, she was subtly questioning the very nature of the judge's authority. It was a masterstroke of legal strategy, and Harrison knew it. After a long, agonizing pause, the judge finally spoke, his voice now low and measured. "I will take your argument under advisement. However, understand this, the decision I make here today could alter the course of legal history." Pam Bondi stood tall, unshaken. "I understand, Your Honor. And I trust you will make the right decision." For a brief moment, the two locked eyes, two legal minds, fiercely opposing, but both recognizing the power of the game they were playing. The courtroom was left in stunned silence, everyone waiting for the final decision. Would Judge Harrison accept the truth Bondi had laid out before him, or would he cling to his original ruling? It was a tense, thrilling standoff, and the world would soon find out how far Pam Bondi was willing to go to prove her legal genius. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Judge Harrison sat in silence, flipping through legal documents with an air of exhaustion and contemplation. His brow furrowed with the weight of the decision before him. No one spoke, even the usual courtroom murmurs had ceased. It was as though the entire building held its breath, waiting for the gavel to fall. Pam Bondi remained poised, her hands neatly folded in front of her. She had delivered her argument. She had pushed every button, pointed out every flaw, and made her case so compelling that even the most hardened legal professionals in the room had been forced to reconsider their stance. But now, it was up to the judge to either acknowledge her brilliance or try to salvage his own reputation. Finally, after a lengthy pause that felt like an eternity, Judge Harrison stood up, his robes flowing with an air of finality. The silence in the room was so complete that the soft shuffle of his feet on the floor sounded louder than it should have. "Ms. Bondi," he began, his voice much softer than it had been earlier, "you have presented an argument that is, without question, well-reasoned and supported by legal precedent." He paused, glancing at her with a look of begrudging respect. "I must admit, I underestimated your abilities. You've proven me wrong." A ripple of surprise ran through the courtroom. No one had expected the judge to admit his error so directly. Many had thought he would dig in his heels, unwilling to back down after making such a public statement. But Bondi didn't gloat. Instead, she simply nodded, acknowledging the judge's words. This was not about winning in the traditional sense, it was about demonstrating that she was, as she had always known, a force to be reckoned with in the legal world. Judge Harrison continued, his voice gaining strength. "That being said, I cannot completely disregard the potential consequences of a ruling in your favor. The law must be applied uniformly, and there are factors I must consider beyond the scope of your case." Bondi's eyes didn't leave his, her mind already anticipating what came next. "And so," the judge said, "while I will reduce the fine, I will not completely nullify it. A fine of $10,000 will be imposed, but I will also direct that part of it be used for legal education seminars aimed at clarifying the legal confusion that has surrounded this case." Bondi's expression remained unchanged, but inside, she was satisfied. The fine was reduced significantly, and more importantly, the judge had acknowledged the flaws in his own ruling, even if he didn't fully concede to her argument. It wasn't a total victory, but it was a significant one. "You are free to leave, Ms. Bondi," the judge concluded, his tone now more neutral, though there was still a trace of respect. "I hope this experience has helped you appreciate the complexity of the legal system." Bondi stood up and collected her things, her eyes sweeping over the courtroom one last time. The spectators, many of whom had initially come to witness a spectacle, were now silent, perhaps reflecting on what they had just seen. The once dismissed figure of Pam Bondi had not only held her ground but had dismantled the case against her with an expertise that few could rival. As she walked out of the courtroom, her heels clicking sharply on the floor, she heard murmurs behind her. People were still talking about the hearing. Some were in awe of her legal prowess, while others were still shocked that she had outmaneuvered Judge Harrison. But all of them knew one thing: Pam Bondi was no longer just a political figure in the background. She was a legal force. The doors of the courtroom closed behind her with a finality that echoed. Bondi smiled to herself. The game had been played, and it was clear who had won. Pam Bondi's victory was far from over. As she stepped out of the courtroom and into the hallway, the whispers grew louder. Her legal maneuver had not only stunned the people in the room but had sent ripples through the entire legal community. Journalists, clerks, and even fellow lawyers buzzed with speculation about what had just transpired. She was no longer just a political figure, she was a legal prodigy. A reporter from a prominent news outlet caught up to her in the hallway, her voice eager. "Ms. Bondi, how does it feel to not only defeat a ruling but to force a judge to openly admit his mistake?" Bondi paused, turning to face the reporter. She gave a small, practiced smile. "It feels like justice, pure and simple. Law is about applying the principles fairly and accurately, no matter who you are or where you come from. I just made sure those principles were respected." The reporter nodded, clearly impressed by her calm demeanor and the certainty in her voice. Bondi had expected such questions, but it didn't faze her. She had handled difficult questions during her career before, and this was no different. As she made her way through the courthouse, she overheard snippets of conversation. Some people were congratulating her, others were questioning the ethics of her legal argument. But no one could deny that she had come out on top. For once, the headlines weren't about her political controversies, they were about her mastery of the law. But with victory came scrutiny. As Bondi left the courthouse and walked to her car, a feeling of unease crept over her. The battle in the courtroom had been just one part of a much larger game, and she knew that winning this round didn't mean the war was over. By the time she reached her office, a call from an old ally in the political world was already waiting for her. The voice on the other end was familiar but laced with concern. "Pam, I just saw the ruling. You've got people talking, on both sides of the aisle. This is big, but it could also be dangerous." Bondi sat at her desk, leaning back in her chair. "I know," she replied, her tone steady but tinged with an awareness of the complexities ahead. "It's not just about the legal victory. This case is now a symbol of everything I've done, everything I've been through. And some people won't let that slide." Her ally paused. "You've made a lot of enemies over the years, Pam. And this just gave them a whole new reason to target you." Bondi's eyes narrowed. "I've always had enemies. But now, they're not just questioning my politics, they're questioning my legal mind. And that's where I have them beat." She wasn't wrong. Despite the initial praise, Bondi knew the battle was far from won. There were those who had been waiting for her to slip up, to make a mistake, especially after this courtroom showdown. Her victory might have been sweet, but it had put a target on her back. Later that evening, as she scrolled through the media coverage of the hearing, she realized just how deep the consequences would run. Some pundits lauded her for her legal expertise, calling it a game-changing moment in her career. Others, however, began to dissect every word she'd said, every move she'd made, looking for signs of weakness or fault. The next day, a new development took the legal world by storm. An anonymous source leaked a document suggesting that Judge Harrison had once received a substantial donation from a political action committee that had long been critical of Bondi's policies. The timing of the leak seemed deliberate. The pressure began to mount. Bondi's old political foes were already circling, using the leak as ammunition to discredit her. Was it a mere coincidence that a judge who had ruled harshly against her had accepted funding from groups that opposed her? Was this proof of bias? "Pam, we need to address this, and fast," her ally said over the phone the next day. "People are starting to question the integrity of your victory." Bondi stared out of her office window, the city stretching before her. She wasn't worried. She had weathered storms before, but this time, she knew the stakes were higher. Her legal genius had been put on display, but it also opened doors for a new kind of scrutiny, one that went far beyond the courtroom. In the coming days, Bondi would have to navigate this new minefield. She couldn't afford to let the controversy distract her from what she'd worked for all her life. Her legal victory had made waves, but it was only a matter of time before the real political game began, the one where reputations were shattered, and careers were made or broken with the press of a button. As the days wore on, Pam Bondi felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for her own legacy anymore. She was fighting to prove that her legal skills were as sharp as they had ever been. And in this new battle, she wouldn't back down. Pam Bondi's victory in court had sent shockwaves through the legal community, but the backlash from the political arena was swift and brutal. The media frenzy surrounding Judge Harrison's questionable connections had only intensified, and now, whispers of corruption and favoritism began to cloud the story. Her once celebrated legal win had become fodder for a new round of attacks that questioned her integrity, her motives, and her ties to the very system she had spent years navigating. Bondi wasn't surprised. She had expected the blowback. What caught her off guard, however, was how quickly her old political adversaries had mobilized. They were relentless, pushing narratives that framed her as not just a skilled lawyer, but as a dangerous political player willing to manipulate the law for her own gain. As the days passed, the pressure mounted. A coordinated campaign began to paint her courtroom success as part of a larger scheme, implying that her legal genius was simply a facade for more insidious motivations. Political commentators and pundits dug through her past, attempting to connect her legal actions with her controversial political decisions, suggesting that her win in court was no accident. It was part of a larger, more calculating strategy to undermine the legal system for personal gain. At the heart of this new attack was an article from a well-known investigative journalist who had uncovered a trail of political donations and connections linking Pam Bondi to a series of corporate interests. The journalist suggested that her courtroom battle against Judge Harrison had been less about the law and more about using her legal expertise to weaken her enemies. Pam Bondi's legal victory, a smokescreen for political power play. The headline read. The article suggested that her courtroom victory was engineered to set the stage for a greater political comeback, one that might involve securing a powerful position, possibly even on the national stage. Bondi read the article and felt a surge of frustration. This was a new low. They weren't just questioning her legal acumen now, they were accusing her of manipulating the very system she had fought to protect. Pam, we need to get ahead of this narrative, her ally, the one who had been with her since the beginning, said over the phone. If we don't, they'll use it to cripple you politically. People are starting to think you're playing both sides. Bondi's jaw clenched. She had been in tough spots before, but this was a whole new ballgame. Her political opponents weren't playing by the old rules, they were going straight for the jugular. That afternoon, she held a press conference to address the growing storm. The room was packed with reporters, cameras flashing, microphones thrust in her direction. Bondi stood at the podium, her face a picture of calm confidence, but inside, she was calculating every word. Let me be clear, she began, her voice firm but measured, my legal victory in court was based on facts, precedents, and a fair reading of the law. It had nothing to do with politics, and it certainly wasn't a strategy to further my career. She paused, scanning the room. I've spent my career fighting for what's right, even when it wasn't popular. And I will continue to do so. If people want to distract from that by questioning my integrity or spinning baseless conspiracies, then so be it. But I will not let anyone undermine the work I've done to uphold the rule of law. The reporters scribbled down notes, some nodding, others skeptical. She knew this press conference wouldn't end the attacks, but it was a start. She had to show that she wasn't afraid of the fight ahead, that she wasn't backing down, no matter how ugly it got. Her next move came quickly. Bondi called in her closest advisors and began to strategize. She knew the political machine was starting to shift against her, but she wasn't going to let her adversaries control the narrative. We need to hit back, hard, Bondi told her team. We'll leak the documents that show the timeline of Harrison's donations and connections with the groups who've been attacking me. Let's turn this into a story about the corruption in the system, not me. Her advisors hesitated, knowing the risks of such a move. Pam, if we go down this road, it's going to be a full-blown war. We'll have to take down some heavy hitters, and they won't go down quietly. Bondi's eyes hardened. I didn't get to where I am by backing down from a fight. The truth is on our side. If they want a war, we'll give them one. And so, the counterattack began. A few days later, Bondi's team leaked internal documents to the press. The documents detailed the extensive political donations made to Judge Harrison's campaign, including funds from groups that had publicly criticized Bondi's policies. The story was a bombshell, one that forced the media to turn its focus from Bondi to the larger issue of political influence in the judiciary. The backlash was swift. Supporters of Bondi rallied around her, calling out the hypocrisy of the establishment. Meanwhile, her detractors scrambled to spin the story back in their favor, but the momentum had shifted. Pam Bondi had not only fought back, she had reframed the entire narrative. In the end, the controversy surrounding the case began to lose its steam. The focus slowly shifted from Bondi's legal tactics to the systemic corruption she had highlighted. And though the political attacks continued, Pam Bondi had proven that, when pushed, she could fight back just as fiercely outside the courtroom as she could inside. The war was far from over, but in this battle, she had shown that she was a force to be reckoned with, one who had not only survived but thrived in the chaos. And as she looked out over the horizon of her next political move, Pam Bondi knew this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. Pam Bondi's move to leak the documents had turned the tide in her favor. The controversy over Judge Harrison's connections was the turning point in a story that was quickly becoming bigger than she had ever anticipated. What had started as a courtroom showdown had evolved into a political firestorm, and now the pressure was on her opponents to explain themselves. The media coverage was relentless, with news outlets from all sides of the spectrum covering the fallout. For the first time in months, Bondi wasn't just reacting to the attacks, she was shaping the narrative. The very machine that had sought to discredit her had now become embroiled in a much larger issue, one that questioned the integrity of the political system at large. But as the weeks wore on, it became clear that this wasn't just a legal victory anymore. It was a political chess match, one that had implications for the future of Pam Bondi's career. And this time, she was playing to win. The shift in public opinion was undeniable. More and more people began to see Bondi not just as a politician or former attorney general, but as someone who had the courage to stand up for what was right, no matter the personal cost. The legal genius who had outwitted her opponents in the courtroom now had a public persona that was reshaped, one that was more resilient, more strategic, and more powerful than ever. As her political foes scrambled to regain control of the narrative, Bondi made her final move. She called a press conference, one that would seal her position in the eyes of the public. The room was packed, but this time, Bondi wasn't just addressing the media. She was addressing the people, the very citizens who had placed their faith in her leadership. She knew they were watching, waiting to see if she would falter, if she would shrink in the face of the ongoing attacks. But Pam Bondi wasn't one to shrink. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice steady and commanding. The past few weeks have been a test, both personally and professionally. I've been asked to defend my legal victory, my character, and my very principles. Some people have questioned my integrity, while others have attempted to turn my work into a political game. But I want to make one thing absolutely clear. She paused for a moment, letting her words hang in the air, before continuing. I don't play games. I never have. My only allegiance is to the law. And I will continue to fight for justice, for fairness, and for the rights of every person who looks to our legal system for protection. The room fell silent as her words echoed in the hall. The reporters leaned in, cameras clicking as they captured every moment. You see, Bondi continued, this isn't just about a court case or about me. It's about something much bigger. It's about the integrity of our judicial system, about the principles that hold our society together. It's about standing up against corruption, wherever it may hide. And it's about making sure that our leaders, both political and judicial, are held accountable for their actions. The crowd was captivated. Bondi had delivered her final blow, not just to her legal opponents but to the political machine that had tried to tear her down. It was a speech for the history books, one that solidified her place in the public's mind as a fighter, a champion for justice, and a woman who would not be intimidated. As the press conference ended and Bondi walked out of the room, she felt a sense of finality wash over her. She had not just survived the storm, she had turned it into an opportunity for growth, for resurgence. The political attacks had only strengthened her resolve, and now, she was stronger than ever. In the weeks that followed, the political landscape began to shift. Bondi's name was no longer associated with scandal or controversy but with resilience, intelligence, and a commitment to the rule of law. Her political allies rallied around her, and her opponents, now weakened, struggled to regain any traction. Bondi knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be new challenges, new battles to face. But for now, she had triumphed, not just in the courtroom, but in the political arena as well. She had proven that no matter how hard they tried to bring her down, Pam Bondi would always rise above. As she looked toward the future, she knew that this was just the beginning of her next chapter, one where she would continue to challenge the status quo, demand accountability, and use her legal genius to serve the people who needed it most. And for Pam Bondi, that was all that mattered.